just 2 hours ago, we hit the ISIS thugs in Syria who were trying to regroup after their decimation by the Trump administration 5 years ago. We hit them hard. I ordered a massive strike on the terrorists that killed our 3 great patriots last week. 2 soldiers, 1 interpreter, all great people. And it was very successful. It was precision. We hit every site flawlessly, and we are restoring peace through strength. We're all over the world. I settled 8 wars in 10 months, destroyed the Iran nuclear threat, ended the war in Gaza, and got the release of hostages, both living and dead, and created peace in the Middle East. We had peace in the Middle East, first time in 3 years. Peace.
So you just watched him stand there at the podium, radiating that grotesque performative masculinity that defines American military imperialism in the 21st century, and you heard him say it with that chest-puffing bravado that would be comical if it weren't attached to the most powerful arsenal of death and destruction on the planet. You heard him claim with absolutely no sense of irony or historical awareness that he ordered a massive strike on Syria, and that somehow this represents not endless war but peace through strength. You heard him brag about settling 8 wars and ending the conflict in Gaza and destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities. And here's the thing that should make your blood boil and your skin crawl, because what we're witnessing in real time is the normalization of American violence, dressed up in the language of peacekeeping, while the bodies pile up and the infrastructure crumbles, and the civilians who never asked for any of this pay the ultimate price, and wait because it gets worse, so much worse than you think. The U.S. struck more than 70 targets across Syria's Badia Desert, including in Homs, Deir az-Zor, and Raqqa provinces using fighter jets, attack helicopters, and more than 100 precision munitions, and Trump dubbed this Operation Hawkeye Strike, referring to Iowa, because 3 Americans, including 2 soldiers, were killed in Palmyra a week earlier, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called this retaliation a declaration of vengeance, which is precisely the kind of language that should terrify anyone who understands that vengeance is not policy, vengeance is not strategy, vengeance is the moral vocabulary of bloodlust, masquerading as justice, and here's where we need to pause and understand the architecture of the lie being constructed before our eyes, because Trump claims this is about restoring peace, but between 1,500 to 3,000 ISIS militants still operate in Syria and Iraq, according to U.S. intelligence, which means these strikes are not ending anything. They're perpetuating the forever war under a new rhetorical framework. And now comes the truly obscene part. The grandiose claims that reveal not confidence but pathological narcissism, married to imperial hubris, because Trump stood there and declared he's settled 8 wars in 10 months, destroyed the Iran nuclear threat, ended the war in Gaza, created peace in the Middle East for the first time in 3 years, and you need to understand that observers dispute that Trump has ended 8 wars or brought peace to the Middle East, because these claims are not just exaggerations, they're fantasy disconnected from material reality. Let me be absolutely clear about Gaza, because over 70,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed since the start of the Israeli offensive, almost half of them women and children, and Israeli bombardment across Gaza continues to result in civilian casualties, displacement and destruction of civilian infrastructure, as of December 2024, which means Trump's claim to have ended the war is a lie so transparent it insults the intelligence of anyone paying attention. Peace has not held in other conflicts where the U.S. was involved, with violence continuing in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda, despite June's deal, and Cambodia and Thailand have accused each other of ceasefire violations, exposing the transactional hollowness of Trump's supposed peace agreements. But let's talk about Iran, because here's where the propaganda reaches truly Orwellian dimensions, and you need to steel yourself for this because the cognitive dissonance is staggering. Trump claims he destroyed the Iran nuclear threat, but here's what actually happened. Trump withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, on May 8, 2018, and the International Atomic Energy Agency asserted that its inspectors had verified Iran was adhering to the terms of the agreement before the withdrawal, which means Trump didn't destroy a nuclear threat, he destroyed the diplomatic framework that was preventing a nuclear threat. The UN's nuclear watchdog said in November that Iran still retains enough highly enriched uranium and technical knowledge and capability to build nuclear weapons, and Trump struck 3 Iranian nuclear facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan in June 2025, escalating regional tensions in a 12-day war, which is not eliminating threats, it's manufacturing crises that justify further military action in a perpetual cycle of violence. So let me connect the dots here, because this is about more than just Trump's pathological lying. This is about the fundamental architecture of American empire and how military violence gets laundered through the rhetoric of liberation and protection. The U.S. has roughly 1,000 troops deployed in Syria fighting ISIS, and they've been operating in eastern Syria for years, training primarily Kurdish partner forces, which means these aren't just retaliatory strikes, these are operations embedded in a decades-long occupation that the American public has been told almost nothing about. And when you understand that there were approximately 2,000 U.S. soldiers stationed in Syria as of December 2024 to continue the fight against ISIS, you realize we're not witnessing peace. We're witnessing the normalization of permanent military presence justified through an ever-morphing threat matrix that can never be fully defeated, because defeat would eliminate the justification for occupation. And here's what should make every progressive absolutely furious about this moment: the way Trump packages this violence as benevolent intervention while ignoring the humanitarian catastrophe his policies have enabled. When he talks about Syria being a place soaked in blood, he conveniently omits that the Syrian Ba'athist government and its foreign allies were responsible for approximately 91% of total civilian casualties between 2011 and 2024. Estimates of total deaths in the Syrian civil war range between 580,000 and 656,493 as of March 2025, which means the violence Trump is adding to this context isn't bringing peace, it's compounding an already apocalyptic level of human suffering. But he doesn't talk about that because acknowledging that reality would require grappling with America's role in destabilizing the region through decades of intervention, from the Iraq War that created the conditions for ISIS's rise to the Saudi-led war in Yemen that the U.S. has backed with weapons and intelligence. And this is the crucial point that gets memory hold in the spectacle of these press conferences where Trump gets to play strongman. Let's be forensic about the Gaza claim, because this is where the moral bankruptcy becomes absolutely undeniable, and if you're not enraged by this, you're not paying attention. Trump says he ended the war in Gaza and secured the release of hostages, but at least 92% of homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed since the war started, and more than 47,000 Palestinians have been killed and more than 111,000 injured since October 2023. About 69% of total structures in Gaza are destroyed, severely damaged, moderately damaged, or possibly damaged, and as of December 17, 2024, at least 45,059 Palestinians had been killed, with an estimated 10,000 remaining under the rubble, which means when Trump talks about peace, he's talking about the peace of the graveyard, the peace that comes from having destroyed a population's capacity to resist through sheer overwhelming force. The UN Human Rights Council affirmed that both Hamas and Israel committed war crimes, and that Israel's actions also constituted crimes against humanity. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity, which means Trump isn't presiding over peace, he's presiding over impunity for atrocities that violate the most fundamental principles of international law. But wait, because there's another layer of propaganda here that we need to deconstruct, and it's the peace through strength formulation that Trump deploys like it's some kind of timeless wisdom, when in fact it's just the repackaging of might makes right authoritarianism. When he says, "We hit the ISIS thugs in Syria who were trying to regroup," and calls them thugs while simultaneously ordering strikes that killed at least 5 ISIS members, including the leader of a cell responsible for drones, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, what he's doing is dehumanizing the targets to justify the violence, and this dehumanization is essential to the imperial project, because you can't maintain public support for endless war if people actually see the human beings on the receiving end as human beings with families and histories and futures that are being obliterated. The use of terms like thugs and terrorists creates a category of killable people whose deaths don't require the same moral scrutiny as the deaths of Americans or Israelis or Europeans, and this is how empire operates, through the construction of hierarchies of human value, where some lives matter infinitely and others don't matter at all. And let's interrogate the timing of this for a second, because it's instructive about how these operations function within the domestic political economy of spectacle. Trump met privately with families of the slain Americans at Dover Air Force Base before he joined top military officials for the dignified transfer, staging the emotional tableau of grief and national honor. And then within days he's announcing these massive retaliatory strikes, and the media dutifully covers it as Trump keeping his promise to avenge fallen heroes, rather than asking the more fundamental question of what American soldiers are doing in Syria in the first place, and whether their presence there actually serves any legitimate security interest, or whether it's just the continuation of a policy that's been on autopilot since 2014. The new military operation in Syria comes even as the Trump administration has said it's looking to focus closer to home in the Western Hemisphere, which reveals the contradiction at the heart of Trump's foreign policy rhetoric. This idea that he's ending interventions while simultaneously expanding military operations across multiple theaters. Now I want you to really sit with the Abraham Accords claim, because this encapsulates everything dishonest about Trump's Middle East narrative and exposes the emptiness of his peace boasting. Trump frequently invokes the Abraham Accords as evidence he created Middle East peace, but the Abraham Accords normalized diplomatic relations among countries that were not engaged in military conflict, and experts said the accords did not yield broad peace in the Middle East. Even more damning, none of the parties to the Abraham Accords were ever engaged in military conflict against each other, so framing normalization as peace is a gross misrepresentation, and the accords bypassed several conflicts including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which means they were never designed to address the core sources of violence and instability in the region. They were designed to create a coalition against Iran, while leaving Palestinians to face occupation and siege without meaningful international pressure on Israel to change course. This is peace as public relations exercise, peace as diplomatic theater that allows autocratic regimes to launder their reputations while the actual structures of oppression remain untouched. But here's where we need to zoom out and understand the ideological function of these claims within the broader landscape of Trumpism and American conservatism, because what Trump is doing when he recites this litany of supposed accomplishments isn't just lying for the sake of lying. He's constructing an alternative reality where American military dominance equals peace, and where the projection of overwhelming force is inherently virtuous regardless of the human consequences. This is the politics of the strongman taken to its logical conclusion, where truth itself becomes subordinate to power, and where the measure of success is not whether people are actually safer or freer or more prosperous, but whether the leader appears decisive and tough and uncompromising. Trump has claimed he ended 7 unendable wars, an assertion that is not only a gross exaggeration, but betrays a flawed understanding of peace itself. And under his administration, peace deals have been treated as an opportunity to secure resources and real estate, revealing that what's being negotiated isn't peace in any meaningful sense but rather the terms of American extraction and geopolitical advantage. And we need to talk about the Syria policy itself, because Trump said Syria's government, formed after the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime in late 2024, was fully in support of the U.S. military operation, which raises profound questions about sovereignty and intervention, because what Trump is describing is the U.S. conducting military operations on Syrian territory with the permission of a government that just came to power after a civil war, and Trump and the new Syrian leader al-Shura have a new but strong relationship built on admiration for each other, according to analysts, which means this is classic imperial management, where the U.S. cultivates client relationships with governments. It can influence and then uses that influence to justify ongoing military operations that serve American strategic interests, rather than the interests of Syrian people. The fact that U.S. authorities considered al-Shura to be a terrorist as recently as last month before removing him from the specially designated global terrorist list ahead of a meeting with Trump tells you everything you need to know about how cynical these designations are, how they're instrumentalized to serve whatever the current policy objective happens to be, rather than reflecting any consistent moral or legal framework. Let me be absolutely clear about what peace through strength actually means in practice. Because this isn't abstract, it's playing out right now in ways that are devastating for the people on the ground. Over 85% of Gaza's residents, approximately 1.8 million people, are displaced, and life expectancy in Gaza is now 35 years lower than before the war, which means an entire generation's future has been stolen. Their capacity to build lives in communities and pursue education and employment has been obliterated. And when Trump talks about creating peace, what he's really describing is the violent suppression of resistance through the infliction of unimaginable trauma. Torrential rain is lashing tent villages that stand where Gaza's towns and cities used to be, with deaths from hypothermia rising as freezing temperatures continue, and children are sleeping on soaked bedding at night. And this is the peace Trump is claiming credit for. This nightmare landscape where people are dying not just from bombs but from exposure and disease and despair. So when you hear Trump say he's settled 8 wars and created peace in the Middle East, what you're actually hearing is the language of empire justifying itself, the language that erases the violence being done in America's name, by recasting that violence as benevolent intervention or necessary defense or the restoration of order. Trump's repeated talking point about solving 8 wars is exaggerated. Per time, the fact that he keeps repeating it, despite the easily verifiable evidence that it's false, tells you this isn't about communicating truth, It's about creating a narrative that serves his political interests and his ego. This is governance as performance, as branding exercise, where the goal is not to actually solve problems, but to claim credit for solving problems in ways that generate positive media coverage and political capital. And if people are actually dying in greater numbers as a result of your policies, well, that's an externality that doesn't register within the narcissistic calculus of the strongman leader. And here's what makes this moment so dangerous, and why progressives need to be absolutely unequivocal in our opposition. The normalization of this rhetoric, the way these claims get repeated without sufficient pushback, creates the conditions for even greater atrocities. Because if you can claim that dropping bombs on 7 countries simultaneously represents peacemaking, then you've severed the connection between language and reality in ways that make democratic accountability impossible. When Hegseth says, "This is not the beginning of a war, it is a declaration of vengeance, and that the United States will never hesitate and never relent to defend our people," what he's doing is pre-authorizing unlimited violence in the name of protection, removing any constraint based on proportionality or discrimination, or the basic recognition that the people being killed in these strikes are also human beings with inherent dignity and rights. This is the discourse of total war imported into what's supposedly peacetime, and once you've normalized that discourse, it becomes functionally impossible to set limits on American military power, because any attempt to impose limits gets framed as weakness or appeasement, or insufficient commitment to protecting American lives. Let's also be clear about the class politics embedded in all of this, because it's not an accident that 2 Iowa National Guard soldiers and a civilian interpreter were killed in Syria. It's not an accident that the people doing the dying for American empire are disproportionately working-class people from states like Iowa who join the military because they need education benefits or health care, or a path to economic stability that isn't available to them in the civilian economy. The people who make the decisions to put troops in Syria, to keep them there for years conducting operations the public knows almost nothing about, to launch retaliatory strikes that will inevitably produce more violence, those people aren't the ones whose bodies are on the line. They're not the ones coming home in flag-draped coffins or living with traumatic brain injuries or struggling with PTSD for the rest of their lives. This is the logic of imperial war, where the costs are socialized onto working-class communities, while the benefits, insofar as there are any, flow to defense contractors and geopolitical strategists and politicians who can burnish their tough-on-terrorism credentials. And I want to pause here to say something about the spectacle of the dignified transfer, because it's important to understand how these rituals function ideologically. Trump attended the dignified transfer at Dover Air Force Base, participating in this solemn ceremony honoring the fallen, and on one level, yes, these ceremonies serve a real function for grieving families and military communities, but on another level, they're part of the apparatus that perpetuates military intervention by sacralizing military sacrifice in ways that make it very difficult to ask whether that sacrifice was necessary or justified or in service of anything other than the continuation of policies that haven't worked. The dignified transfer becomes a kind of emotional blackmail, where questioning the war means disrespecting the troops who died in it, and this makes it almost impossible to build the political coalition needed to actually end these interventions, because you're always arguing against not just the policy, but against the memory of the dead and the grief of their families. So here's what we're left with. U.S. forces struck more than 70 targets across central Syria, with more than 100 precision munitions. Trump is claiming this represents peace through strength. He's boasting about settling 8 wars and ending the war in Gaza and destroying Iran's nuclear threat. And none of it is true. None of it describes the reality of what's actually happening on the ground, where between 580,000 and 656,493 people have died in Syria's civil war, and where over 70,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, and where Iran still retains enough enriched uranium and technical capability to build nuclear weapons. What Trump is describing is fantasy. It's the revenge fantasy of the authoritarian leader who believes his will alone can reshape reality, who thinks that declaring victory is the same as achieving victory, who operates in a media ecosystem that rewards bombast and spectacle over accuracy and accountability. This is American empire in its decadent phase, no longer even pretending to be about spreading democracy or defending freedom, just naked assertions of dominance packaged in the thinnest veneer of humanitarian concern. And the fact that Trump can stand there and make these claims with a straight face while people in Gaza are dying from hypothermia in their tents, and while at least 45,059 Palestinians had been killed as of December 17, 2024, tells you everything you need to know about the moral void at the center of this project. We are watching the language of peace being deployed to justify and normalize and celebrate violence on a scale that would be prosecuted as war crimes if committed by any country other than the United States or its allies. And the fact that this happens in full view, that Trump announces it proudly rather than trying to hide it, reveals how completely the ideology of American exceptionalism has inoculated the political class and much of the public against recognizing the horror of what's being done in their name. So what do we do with this? How do we respond to a president who lies with such brazen indifference to truth, who turns mass violence into a campaign talking point, who measures success not in lives saved or suffering alleviated, but in enemies killed and infrastructure destroyed? We name it. We refuse to let the propaganda stand unchallenged. We insist on connecting the dots between these military strikes and the decades of failed intervention that produced the conditions requiring the strikes. We center the voices of the people living through the violence rather than the generals and politicians narrating it from positions of safety, and we build the political movement capable of forcing a fundamental reorientation of American foreign policy away from militarism and toward actual peace rooted in justice and self-determination and the recognition of universal human dignity. Because until we do that, until we break the grip of the bipartisan foreign policy consensus that treats military intervention as the default response to every crisis, we're going to keep getting these grotesque performances where presidents boast about bombing and call it peacemaking, while the bodies pile up and the region burns, and nothing fundamental ever changes except the justifications get more audacious, and the lies get more transparent, and the space for democratic accountability continues to shrink. This is the machine, this is how it works, and it will keep working exactly this way until we summon the collective courage to dismantle it.